Good morning. Welcome to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom webinar series, Systematic, Ongoing, Egregious, Assaults on International Religious Freedom. In today's webinar, we will be focusing on Iraq. My name is Anurima Bhargava, and I was appointed this past December by Speaker Nancy Pelosi to serve on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF. USCIRF is an independent, bipartisan advisory body created 20 years ago by the International Religious Freedom Act. Our mandate is to monitor religious freedom abroad and to make policy recommendations to Congress, the President, and Secretary of State. It is important to note that we use international standards as a yardstick, referencing Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states, quote, "Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion." End quote. We advocate equally for people of all religions and the universal right to believe or not to believe. We also produced an annual report on about 30 countries that we divide into two tiers. The first tier of countries are those that we recommend to be designated countries of particular concern. Those are countries where they have systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom. The second tier of countries is those that have systematic, ongoing, or egregious violations of religious freedom, but one or two and not three. Iraq, the country that we are talking about today, is a tier 2 country. The commission is made up of about nine commissioners that are appointed by members of both parties, leaders of the Democratic and Republican parties. And today, we also are joined by one of our full-time professional staff, Kurt Werthmuller, who is joining us. He is a supervisory policy analyst with a particular emphasis on religious freedom in Iraq, Egypt, and the Levant. Prior to joining USCIRF, he was an associate professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the American University in Dubai. Let me turn it over to Kurt.
Thank you, Anurima. What I'd like to start with today is a little bit of overview and some background in, of course, U.S. relations with Iraq in broader terms, but also our particular concerns related to religious freedom. When we talk about Iraq, it's important to note that this is a country that does present a sort of a uniquely challenging case study in terms of U.S. policy in the recent past. This was, after all, a country that was an active U.S. war zone for 8 years, and again has been the site of direct U.S. military engagement to root out the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria since 2014. So it's important, before we dig into some of that background, to provide a few quick caveats about those complicated dynamics. First of all, the U.S. relationship with Iraq in general terms over the last 3 or 4 decades has been a long one and an unusually complicated one. Going back to U.S. support for the Iraqi government against Iran in those two countries' war, from 1980 to 1988, the U.S.-led coalition's successful effort to roll back Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1991, and the era of UN sanctions between 1990 and 2003, and of course, the large-scale military effort to overthrow the former Ba'athist regime in 2003. Now, we don't have the time or the specific focus today to recap or rehash all of those particular events, but it is important to recognize them and to recognize that that relationship between the U.S. and Iraq has been a very complex and a very fraught one over the last few decades. Furthermore, while our most important interest for USCIRF is thinking about religious freedom conditions in Iraq and thinking about it as an essential component of U.S. policy vis-a-vis Iraq, but at the same time, we do recognize that it's one of several truly pressing concerns related to the country. Among other issues, U.S. priorities, of course, involve engaging in the very real effort to prevent a resurgence of ISIS, and at the same time to impede Iran's efforts to further integrate themselves into Iraq's economy, society, politics, and not to mention military affairs. What will become apparent, I think, as we go through our conversation today is that these other policy concerns are actually closely tied to religious freedom conditions in Iraq in many different and complicated ways. So looking back over the last couple of decades in terms of USCIRF's particular interests, it's worth noting that Iraq has been in our reporting really since the very beginning for most of the last 20 years as either a tier 2 or former watch list entry, or on occasion as a tier 1 country of particular concern. Well, the tragic irony of Iraq in terms of its current challenges is that this is a country with tremendous human, economic, and all sorts of potential. And it's also traditionally been home to one of the region's most ethnically and religiously diverse populations. Apart from the major religious groups of the Shia Muslim majority and the Sunni Muslim minority, which together constitute somewhere between 95 and 98% of the population, Iraq also once hosted a large Chaldean and Assyrian Christian population of around 1.5 million people. It was also home to around 500,000 Yazidis, in addition to lots of other smaller ethno-religious groups, such as Shabak Shia, Mandayans, Kikai, and others. But these traditional demographics faced major and quite negative shifts beginning in the mid-2000s against the backdrop of the civil and largely sectarian conflict that followed the collapse of the Ba'athist former regime. USCIRF, it's important to note, was one of the first US government agencies to sound the alarm bell in the mid-2000s regarding the serious and imminent threats that this violence posed to the country's religious minorities. That included challenges for the Sunni Muslim community under the newly empowered and Shia Muslim-led government at the time, and of course death threats that radical Islamic insurgents were directing toward Christians, Yazidis, and others. Those threats, sadly, were realized throughout the remainder of that decade and into the current one. In fact, by the time of the early 2000s, when in many parts of the country a certain relative measure of calm had been established, and I use that term relative very carefully, forced displacement had slashed the country's Christian population to around a third of its pre-2003 size, and the Yazidis, another major religious group, had suffered some of the worst casualties that it had faced in generations, such as a terrorist bombing campaign in 2007 that killed nearly 800 people in Sinjar. Well, these already difficult circumstances, as we all know, were again compounded beginning in 2014, when a combination of dynamics, including lingering sectarian resentment, spillover from the civil war in neighboring Syria, and other issues, contributed to the rise of ISIS and its perpetration of horrific atrocities against religious and ethnic minorities in northwest Iraq, mainly focused in the areas of Sinjar and the Nineveh Plain. ISIS chased Christians from their towns, executed Yazidi men, abducted around 6,000 Yazidi women and children into sexual slavery, in addition to hundreds of Shabak and Turkmen victims who faced similar fates. These atrocities were to the extent that in December of last year, the US formally recognized those atrocities as genocide in House Resolution 390, known as the Iraq and Syria Genocide Relief and Accountability Act. Well, that brings us more or less up to the present. And in light of all of these challenges and very serious issues, Commissioner Bhargava, Vice Chair Nadine Maenza, and myself visited Baghdad last month. Among other responsibilities we had was in part to assess country conditions for ourselves during that brief visit. What we found there, despite a few glimmers of hope, was a situation for religious minorities that remains tenuous at best and truly dire at worst. It is true, and I do want to acknowledge that in part thanks to significant support from USAID and other countries for reconstruction and stabilization efforts in the Nineveh Plain, some communities have begun the process of recovery. For example, Christian representatives and NGOs with a real presence on the ground in Iraq told USCIRF that in some traditionally Christian towns, such as Bartella and Karakosh, an estimated 30 to 50% of the displaced residents have in fact returned from Kurdish governed territory and IDP camps. This news was encouraging, but it was also an important reminder that the remaining significant number of people from those very same communities have not yet felt safe enough to return like those others have. So this news was encouraging, but it also was important to point out that these people that have not yet returned have faced some short-term and very, very real concerns, such as the presence of militias from the Popular Mobilization Forces, or PMF, and fears that ISIS may regroup. But at the same time, they're looking at some long-term issues, such as weighing whether migrating from Iraq and leaving the country altogether or looking for that local stability are the best options or the real and feasible keys to their survival as communities. Finally, the Yazidi community in particular faces some very harsh circumstances. Their homeland of Sinjar remains largely empty and in ruin, as displaced families have felt largely safer staying up in IDP camps in Duhok and elsewhere in northern Iraq. They continue to bemoan the power of the PMF to control travel to and around Sinjar, and not to mention the lack of nearly any means of livelihood waiting for them there if they do indeed return to Sinjar. They also point to the lack of justice and accountability for ISIS fighters and leaders who slaughtered and enslaved their people, as Iraqi courts push through mass trials of ISIS suspects, largely on terrorism charges rather than on atrocities or war crimes. They also point as a community to the world's apparent disinterest in the nearly 3,000 women and children who ISIS had abducted and to this day remain unknown, nearly 2 years after ISIS was defeated on Iraqi soil. So these are some very real and serious ongoing challenges. And I'm going to turn it over to Anurima at this point to provide some personal observations about some of the key issues that she saw during our recent visit.
Thank you, Kurt. I want to sound and underscore some of the points that Kurt has just made, particularly about the Yazidi community. When we traveled to Baghdad earlier this summer, our primary purpose was to support the Yazidi community as Yazda commemorated the 5th anniversary of the genocide by ISIS. The Yazidi community has been of critical importance for the Commission and a focal point of our efforts in Iraq, as are many other religious components in communities in Iraq, including the Christians, the Mandaeans, the Kakais, and other vulnerable Iraqi components. It was an honor and deeply moving for us to be able to participate in the commemoration, and we were the only U.S. government body to come from outside of Iraq to join the U.S. ambassador, other foreign dignitaries, UN officials, and local embassy staff to honor the genocide victims and support the survivors. There were a few things that I wanted to reflect on about the commemoration itself. First, while the Iraqi government has otherwise made some limited efforts to recognize the atrocities that the Yazidi community has experienced under ISIS, no high-ranking public officials attended the commemoration. A single representative from the Prime Minister's office offered some brief remarks, but neither the President nor the Prime Minister or the Speaker of Parliament or any of their immediate deputies attended the commemoration. Instead, it was largely left to foreign dignitaries, Iraqi members of parliament that represent the religious components, minority religious communities, and mostly Muslim religious leaders to voice their support for the Yazidi community. This absence spoke volumes regarding the indifference from the authorities to what the Yazidis continue to experience and what they could experience 5 years ago. Second, the Yazidi community is a community that, as the commemoration really reflected, remains deeply traumatized and is still far from a position where they can even begin to process healing and recovery. It has been 5 years since many of the members of that community watched their families disappear, were enslaved, and became, were sexually assaulted, raped multiple times by members of ISIS. And The genocide for many of them continues to the present because they don't know where their families are. They haven't had a chance to understand who the perpetrators are, to actually hold them accountable or look them in the eye and try and figure out what justice would look like. They are instead trying to survive in those IDP camps. And they're still looking for nearly 3,000 women and children who ISIS abducted and still remain unaccounted for. There are also mass graves where many believe that their families are, but those mass graves are still in the process of being uncovered, and many of those who are disappeared have not been accounted for. Despite the availability of the United States and other foreign aid to rebuild communities should they return, the threat of the PMF militias and the complete lack of infrastructure and ability for them to pursue their livelihoods in Sinjar prevent them from coming home. Third, to talk about what Kurt mentioned in terms of the justice and accountability for ISIS fighters and leaders, that has been something that has been far away from and out of reach and out of sight for those Yazidi members of the Yazidi community, both the children, the women, and the families who were directly and so closely impacted by what the ISIS fighters did. And they feel the pain of that injustice. The process right now is one where there are many mass trials of those who were involved from ISIS, but that is not a way in which a couple of really important processes should happen, which is that there's a feeling that people can see justice happening, that they know who's involved, that there's a way in which they get an accurate sense of what it is that happened, that there's a way in which the missing gaps of what occurred and who disappeared are ones that they can actually have a sense of information and documentation about. And so there's a lot of concerns about what does it mean to actually have justice in Iraq right now. Punishment, while incredibly important for holding those who actually committed these atrocities accountable, is not always the way in which to bring a sense of closure and peace for those who've experienced what it is that the Yazidi community and other religious communities have experienced in Iraq. So for me, I look at what it means to be 5 years after a genocide where there's still so many unknowns and there's so much trauma and pain that is still being experienced by these families, and yet in all of that, they still don't have a way home and a way back to what it is that they have known for generations. I'm going to turn it back over to Kurt to talk about some of the recommendations that we have made in previous years and coming out of the trip that we recently made to Baghdad.
Thank you, Anurima. What I'd like to do is go through the recommendations that we've made this year in relation to religious freedom in Iraq. I'd like to provide them with a little bit of context and where appropriate, a little bit of updating too, because our trip highlighted a few of the areas in which these recommendations can be particularly useful, and also served as a good reminder of the ways in which those issues that we remarked on in our last annual report remain salient and remain key and remain crucial for helping improve conditions in Iraq. So first of all, and perhaps foremost, it's important to continue to look to expedite the dispersal of U.S. assistance for the rehabilitation and stabilization of areas liberated from ISIS control, in part in order to facilitate the return of displaced and vulnerable communities and others whose religious and ethnic divisions ISIS exploited. To translate that, what we need to continue to do is remind U.S. policymakers and all of those who are engaged in Iraq that we are not out of the woods yet. Or I really shouldn't talk about that terms of we, those people who were hardest hit in Iraq on the ground, they are not out of the woods yet. They still need a tremendous and almost immeasurable amount of help. And so it's important that we continue to push as much as possible through, as we can make a difference as the U.S. government, push opportunities to disperse effectively and to the right groups on the ground, assistance for those communities. To make sure that all of the funding is available and provided through USAID and other other means of dispersing aid. What we saw so far was a really good start. There are some hardworking and very knowledgeable people who are involved in that process of dispersing assistance. And we want to see that continue and to grow to really help those communities to recover and to get home. Secondly, we want to make sure that in all of our military and security assistance to the Iraqi federal government and to the Kurdistan regional government, that the full integration of their security forces really should reflect the country's religious and ethnic diversity, and that we also make sure to assist them in training on international human rights standards about how to treat civilians, especially religious minorities. One of the words that we heard over and over in terms of security, in terms of military concerns, in terms of politics, frankly, was the word representation. The fact is that religious minority communities in Iraq, or components, as they much prefer to refer to themselves, as integral parts of Iraqi society, feel that there's still a long road ahead of them in terms of representation, that the Iraqi government acknowledges them as important components of Iraqi society, that they're involved in the decision-making processes of the country. And when it comes to real concerns of security on the ground, that those who are protecting them reflect them, that it's not just people coming from far-flung parts of the country, or in many cases, like with the PMF, there are actually antagonistic militias that are the ones that are surrounding them and you know, setting up checkpoints and blocking roads and those sorts of things. And that's really, really problematic. We really need to continue to push very hard that all of our aid goes to ways that improve those areas of representation. Third, we want to support legislation in the US that would specifically target for sanctions Iranian-controlled or Iranian-allied factions of the PMF, especially those that have contributed to sectarian violence and have really complicated efforts to restore security and stability in Iraq. Now, we specifically mentioned in our last annual report a couple of groups, including Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba, but it's also important to note that in the interim, there actually has been some movement in this regard. Treasury Department announced global Magnitsky sanctions on 4 Iraqi individuals in July. 2 of those were actually specific leaders of PMF factions that have caused real hardship for religious components in Iraq. Those included Rayan al-Kaldani, who is the head of the 50th Brigade. This is a militia that has caused real hardship in the Nineveh Plain, particularly for the community of Batnea. Rayan al-Kaldani himself is a brutal militia leader. And these sanctions, we discovered when we were on the ground in Iraq, really had some bite. Almost every group that we talked to there, whether they're directly involved or directly impacted by the PMF or not, talked about this. So it's very clear that we as the US government, made some important steps in this regard. The other individual related to the PMF that was named was Wad Qadu, who's the leader of the 30th Brigade Militia. This is a primarily Shabak Shia militia. This one has created some real problems in the town of Bartella, which in and of itself already has some sectarian tensions. This is a town that was traditionally almost completely Christian. After the ISIS crisis, a lot of people began to come back to town, but there were also a lot of members of the Shabak community who also had been displaced with ISIS and began to move into the town. There's been a lot of internal debate and frankly argument about what that means, whether the militias are intentionally pushing those communities to sort of repopulate and shift the demographics of Bartella and other communities. That's a bigger question for another time, but the fact that that's a matter of concern should be something that we're aware of, and we should do all that we can to, you know, damage the prospects for militia leaders like this who play a part in those tensions. There are also a couple of other sort of broader regional political and economic issues that do play an important role in the inability, especially in northern Iraq, to find some security and stability. One of those is that we've recommended that the U.S. government continue to do everything it can to encourage the Iraqi federal government and the Kurdistan regional government to peacefully resolve their outstanding disputes over, of course, territory, budget concerns, oil resources, because these concerns have really impeded the ability of both of those authorities to fully address the ISIS threat and to allow displaced communities to return home in safety. Now, of course, this relationship between the federal government and the KRG reached its lowest point just about 2 years ago after the KRG's referendum to declare independence. To make a very long and very complicated story short, it didn't go as planned. The Iraqi army ended up marching into some of the areas that the KRG had claimed, including the city of Kirkuk, which has a significant proportion of oil resources. Now, relations between the federal government and the KRG have definitely improved over the course of those 2 years, but they haven't moved much closer to resolving any of these major disputes that have been outstanding for years and years. And so we need to do everything we can to resolve those, so then both of these governments, both of these authorities can look to restoring that internal security everywhere that they can. Finally, we also want to encourage both the federal government and the KRG to prevent the expropriation of homes and properties of religious and ethnic minorities by dominant communities, and to create a framework to finally and clearly resolve these disputes. This has been a long-standing concern and very vocal concern on the part of religious and ethnic minorities in northern Iraq in particular, but really in other parts of the country as well, that successive governments in the past used demographic changes like property expropriation to really kind of shift where people were, kind of a divide and conquer issue. And even though the current Iraqi government, I think it would be unfair to say that it's directly and explicitly doing that at the moment, or the KRG for that matter, the reality is that property disputes continue to be a very, very sensitive issue, very often a result of corruption, of local power grabs, and some broader issues like that. And there have been a lot of homes and properties, farms, businesses of religious and ethnic minorities that have been simply seized by rich and powerful people and not been returned to their rightful owners. Now, some of this is related to the very poor system in Iraq of deeds and formally recognizing ownership of properties. All of these things need to finally and permanently and clearly be resolved. And we really should continue to encourage both the federal government and the KRG to really crack down on these issues and come to some resolution. So those are our recommendations and a little bit of context in terms of where we are at this point. And I believe now we'd like to spend a little bit of time seeing what questions all of you might have that are participating with us today. And we'll do our best to provide some context from the perspective of USCIRF and particular religious freedom conditions as possible.
Thank you, Kurt, and we welcome all of your questions.
Well, the first question we have up here, if I may take this one,
Sure.
Anurima, is the question of whether Iraq is still a threat, even though ostensibly it was defeated on Iraqi soil in 2017 and then in neighboring Syria earlier this year. And the question remains, why are minorities still afraid of them? Well, the reality is, as we've reported, is that ISIS is, of course, destroyed as a territory controlling entity, but it is not gone as a terrorist organization, frankly. Even though it lost its control of territory, both in Iraq and in Syria, its fighters did not simply disappear. Some of them surrendered, but many of them did not. And most of those have gone into hiding, either to sort of blend back into the local populations, sometimes to literally go hide out in isolated areas such as mountainous areas, caves. This is a familiar story to those who have followed counterterrorism issues over the last couple of decades. And the reality is that even though in the Iraqi context, Their last territorial control fell in late 2017. Throughout 2018, as we put in our annual report, there were still dozens of likely ISIS attacks on all sorts of people, from Iraqi military figures to politicians to local authorities to, yes, religious and ethnic minorities. There were dozens of ISIS attacks on a monthly basis, perhaps, as the statistics suggest, perhaps up to around an average of 70 attacks each month throughout 2018 that could be attributed to ISIS remnants. So this is a real issue. In fact, our Department of Defense just last month, I believe it was, issued a new report describing the ways in which ISIS remains a very real and present danger. And so all of Iraqi society, and particularly those religious minorities who suffered under literal enslavement and brutality and genocide from ISIS, have good reason to be concerned until that threat is finally and truly eliminated.
And just to briefly add to that, I think that one of the reasons why justice and accountability is so incredibly important, how a country moves from a time of extraordinary violence to one where those who are displaced don't feel like they continue to be isolated. They don't feel like they don't have the feeling or the reality that justice is actually happening, or it's happening in such a way that it's so harsh and blunt, which is part of the concerns about some of the processes in Iraq at this moment, that it actually then creates those who may want to engage in violence and don't feel like they're being accounted for, and there's a concern that ISIS may pick up from those communities who really feel like they have not been able to see justice and to feel like they are part of the homeland that they had been a part of for so long. And so that's a continuing concern, and one that underscores why it's so important that there be a justice and accountability process that people feel like is fair and inclusive of all. So we have a couple of other questions. I'm gonna read one of them, and then both Kurt and I can take a gander at it. Second is the Iraqi government currently doing anything to support the religious minorities who are victims by ISIS, and could it be doing more? As I previously mentioned, I think there has been some lip service played to what it is that the Yazidi community experienced 5 years ago, and certainly what it continues to experience today. I think there's a number of ways in which the Iraqi government, both in word and in deed and in action, can support the Yazidi community in ways that it has not thus far, to ensure that they can actually have a safe return to their homeland, and that they have some ways in which they could then thrive in the lands and in the spaces that they had lived for so long. And there's a number of ways in which we'd like to see that happen, and it's going to be increasingly important that those who are currently still unaccounted for, that they are identified, that we find out the Iraqi government plays a role in figuring out where people are, and again in holding people accountable and having a process in place for justice that actually promotes peace, that addresses the trauma that the Yazidi community has experienced and other religious minority communities have experienced, and that puts Iraq in a place where it can go back to where it had once been, which is where there were a lot of the communities who were able to live side by side in a way that wasn't part of a cycle of violence that we see today.
Very well put, Anurima. Absolutely. To add to that and to follow on to Anurima's comments, the Iraqi government, to think about a few specifics, has been taking a few steps and I want to be clear to acknowledge those steps, has been making a few, maybe we could call them baby steps, maybe we can call them some initial promising signs of addressing some of these issues. For example, we were assured by Iraqi government officials while we were in the country that particularly the president is currently working on some decrees that will recognize both the particular atrocities that face the Yazidis and other religious and ethnic components of the country, to both formally recognize what they suffered under ISIS and also to perhaps provide some compensation. We are encouraged to hear that, and we will be much more encouraged if those things actually come through and become a formal part of Iraqi law, of course. The other thing that the Iraqi government has taken some steps toward, and I use some very loosely here because there's a very, very long way to go, is that earlier this summer, the Prime Minister Abdel Mahdi issued a decree to integrate the popular mobilization forces into the Iraqi armed forces. Now, if this were to take place, it would be an enormous step, and it would go a long way toward providing some command and control for those factions and reining back their ability to, in many cases, directly terrorize religious and ethnic minorities in delicate and hurting parts of the country. But having said that, at this point, there's been some modest movement in terms of implementing that decree, but still with a very, very long way to go. As most of you participating either know or can probably guess, those factions have not been very welcoming of that decree and have pushed back, have even tried to rile up some protests in local communities that would, make it look as if the public is against this control. The sense that we have is there's a lot, even though the question of the PMF is quite complicated, they did play an integral role in defeating ISIS, of course, and in some areas they represent different minority communities, but a lot of them are very closely tied to the IRGC with a very clear Iranian influence. And of course, these are armed factions functioning outside of the Iraqi state. So if we can do as a government everything we can to support Iraq in actually implementing this order for those PMF factions to either integrate into the armed forces, to transform into political parties, as that original decree said, or to disarm and disband, it would go a long way toward providing some safety and security that would allow communities that are displaced to return home. So these are some steps we have seen the Iraqi government taking, but again, these are baby steps. There's a very, very long way to go. It's very clear that up until now, September 2019, that the issue of safety and security in Nineveh Plain and other parts of northern Iraq is just as important and unresolved as it's ever been. And we really need to see some forward motion on that. And this is my last comment on this particular question, this is setting aside some of the other broader structural issues related to religious freedom in the country. We're not even getting into the question of curriculum, the way that different religious communities talk about each other and represent each other in public school curriculum. We're not talking about corruption in the country, which plays a big role sometimes in things like the effective dispersal of aid. So, there's a lot of other areas that are areas of concern of religious freedom in Iraq, but we're kind of thinking about the most urgent issues.
Yeah, and Crash, I wanted to add two things, which are in the realm of policy considerations and process considerations. One is, as Kurt mentioned earlier, that of land rights, which is for communities like the Yazidis who lived on lands in the Nineveh Plains and elsewhere in Sinjar for generations. The way that they thought about land and documentation of land rights is quite different, which is they may not be a paper trail for that, right? And as people have been displaced and want to come home, there are concerns about the ways in which land rights and who is able to reclaim their homelands, what that process will look like. There are concerns about the displacement of communities and then the retaking of that land for economic development and other such projects. And so the question of how and in what ways people can feel like they can return to their homelands and to where they rightfully have lived for many generations is an important one. The second is, a concern about the ways in which for those women and girls who were subject to sexual assault and rape by ISIS fighters, that in some ways their children, those who are born of that kind of violence, are being deemed Muslim and not Yazidi. Yazidis in the way in which their documentation is presented, and that's having an impact on how those children and those women and families are being welcomed back into the Yazidi community. And so there's concerns again about how we describe and document the kind of violence and the impact that violence has had on families, and again towards a process by which communities that have been broken apart and separated can come together again in a peaceful way. And so those are a couple of the many ways in which the process, the way in which communities are built up again is so important in terms of frankly the details and understanding how it is that people and communities lived for so long, and the ways in which those traditions need to be reflected in what's happening now. We have a third question, which is how does the Kurdistan regional government factor into the dynamics that we've described today? Kurt, I'll have you take a hand at that, and then we'll add what I can.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's important to notice that even though to a certain degree our emphasis today has been looking at some of the areas that are currently under Iraqi federal control, like the Plain and Sinjar and others, these have also been areas that have been directly related to the disputes between the KRG and the federal government, long-standing, deep-seated disputes over territory and resources. The KRG is an integral part of this conversation for lots of practical ways and broader ways as well. And the reality is that in 2014, when ISIS marched into the Nineveh Plain and Sinjar and other parts of northern Iraq, not even getting into the question of Syria at the moment, those people who fled in advance, who managed to survive the ISIS incursion, most of them fled to Kurdistan, to KRG territory, and a few other IDP camps in northern Iraq. And so the reality is that the KRG has, in the current crisis over the last several years, has been host and has provided a safe refuge for many of those displaced communities, tens and tens of thousands of those IDPs. That's a relationship with displaced people that actually extends even back before ISIS. Many of those Christians and others who fled from Baghdad and other parts of the country during sectarian violence between 2003 and 2011, a lot of them fled up to KRG territory as well and found refuge in places like the region of Ankawa in Erbil, the capital of Kurdistan Regional Government Territory. And simply by being host for many of these displaced communities, that in and of itself places the KRG right at the center of many of these conversations. And it's important to recognize the way that they have provided that refuge. I don't want to give the impression that it's a paradise for religious and ethnic minorities. There are concerns there just like there are in other parts of the country too. Questions that Anurima referred to about property rights, those also remain a long-standing grievance of religious minorities or religious components in KRG territory as well. The question of the expropriation of properties, of homes, of businesses is a very real one and largely unresolved. Now, we've been told by KRG representatives that they're not ignoring this issue, that it's just a very complicated one and a very deep-rooted one. Acknowledging that it is complicated, we also still continue to urge the KRG to pay attention and to find some resolution for these issues, understanding that this is also along with some of their broader issues vis-a-vis the federal government. So, this is, when we talk about the KRG, it's part of Iraq. And these issues and dynamics that affect displaced people in federal territory also continue to impact the KRG. There are going to be, unfortunately, the only place for refuge for many of these displaced peoples until conditions are sufficiently safe for them to return home in Nineveh, in Sinjar, and other places.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining our webinar today. We are looking forward to having webinars in the future on different countries and topics. We encourage you to reach out to your representatives in Congress and to the administration to ask them to make religious freedom and the support and inclusion of those who've suffered from religious persecution and violence, no matter where they stand, a priority in foreign policy. Please visit the website at uscirf.gov, that's USCIRF.gov. Download our report and a number of the other briefings and papers that we have. Kurt's email, I believe, is listed on the screen, so you should feel free to reach out to him as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.